Before anyone in the ballroom noticed the violinist falter mid-note, before the chandelier light seemed to dim against the silk of 200 shoulders turning at once, a quiet woman in a borrowed gown stepped through the eastern doors of the Holloway estate and stopped the breath of every person in the room. The host, who had spent his entire life choosing exactly when other people were allowed to feel small, felt his champagne glass tilt half an inch in his hand. Because men like him were used to laughter, not silence like this. Even Caspian Holloway, who had once made a senator cry at his own birthday party, could not look away. The Holloway estate sat on the highest ridge of Bremerton County, a pale limestone manor that had been built in 1912 by a steel magnate who had never trusted banks. It had 38 rooms, 2 ballrooms, a glass conservatory, and a long, curving driveway lined with white pin oaks. The gravel was raked every morning by a man named Otis, who had worked there for 19 years and who still removed his cap whenever he passed the front gate. Tonight, every window glowed amber against the November dark. Black cars idled along the drive, releasing women in floor-length silk and men in dinner jackets, the kind of guests whose names appeared in newspapers and whose faces appeared on the back pages of charity programs. The Holloway Foundation Autumn Gala was the most important social event in the county, and Caspian Holloway, at 42 years old, had hosted it for the 7th consecutive year. The maid stood at the eastern doors with her hand resting lightly on the brass handle. She was 33 years old. Her name was Ondine Vasper. She had been employed at the estate for 10 months, and until this evening she had never been seen by any of the guests who passed through these doors. She had cleaned their wine glasses before they arrived. She had ironed the linen napkins they would press to their lips. But she had never been seen. She had a face that did not announce itself. Soft brown eyes that always seemed to be considering something just out of view. Dark hair that she wore pinned at the nape of her neck during her shifts, but tonight had been swept up by a woman she had never met into a low, elegant twist that revealed the long line of her throat. She wore a gown of deep navy silk, pulled from a closet on the 3rd floor, where the previous lady of the house had left her unworn dresses behind when she moved out 4 years ago. The gown was a half size too long. She had pinned the hem herself in the servants' bathroom, kneeling on the cold tile in stockinged feet, biting her lip to keep her hands steady. She had no escort. She had no name on the guest list. She had been invited only because Caspian Holloway, 3 glasses into a bottle of cognac the previous Sunday, had looked across the breakfast room at the woman dusting his bookcases, and had laughed and said to his oldest friend, "Wouldn't it be marvelous, Renwick? Wouldn't it just be the most marvelous joke if we put her in a dress and dropped her into the gala? Watch her fumble with the salad fork. Watch her stare at the senators." Renwick Cole had laughed. He always laughed when Caspian made a joke. And then Caspian, who never said anything he was not prepared to follow through on, had walked over to the woman dusting cloth still in her hand, and had told her she was invited to the gala. Black tie, Saturday evening, 8 o'clock. He had smiled the way men smile when they have already written the punchline of a joke in their heads, and he had walked out of the room before she could refuse. She had not refused. She had stood very still for a long moment, and then she had folded the dusting cloth carefully into thirds, and she had placed it on the edge of the bookshelf, and she had walked back to the laundry room with her hands trembling at her sides for reasons that had nothing to do with fear of him. That had been 6 days ago. Tonight, the small clutch in her left hand held only 3 things: a folded handkerchief that had belonged to her grandmother, a photograph the size of a playing card, worn soft at the edges from being touched too often, and a single white envelope she had carried in her coat pocket for many years and had not yet opened. She closed her eyes for one breath. Then she opened them. Then she opened the door. To understand why Ondine Vasper was standing at the eastern doors that evening, you would have to go back to a town called Pellinor Bend, a town small enough that the post office shared a building with the tax assessor. She had grown up in a house at the end of Wexford Lane, a narrow gray house with a tilted porch and a kitchen window that looked out onto a field of alfalfa. Her mother had been a seamstress, the kind of woman who took in wedding gowns and prom dresses and funeral suits for half the county. Her father had been a high school music teacher who played the piano in the evenings with the front door open so the neighbors could hear, who taught Ondine the names of every key on the keyboard before she could read, who told her every night before bed that her name meant Little Wave and that one day she would carry music the way water carries light. He had died when she was 15, a truck on a wet road. A funeral with rain falling sideways. After that, the house had grown quieter, and Ondine had grown quieter inside it, and her mother had taken on more sewing work to keep the heat on through the winters. By the time Ondine was 18, she had won a state piano competition, then a regional one, then a national one. She had been offered a full scholarship to a conservatory in the East, the kind of school that produced concert pianists and recording artists. She had gone. She had thrived. She had played in halls with names she had only ever read in books. She had met a young composer in her third year, a kind, quiet man named Thaddeus Marlowe, who had brown eyes and ink-stained fingers and who had asked her to marry him on a bridge in the snow when she was 22. She had said yes. They had been married for 3 years and 4 months when the diagnosis came. He was 26. The doctors said the kindest thing they could say, which was that there was time, but not much. Ondine had walked out of the consultation room and into a hallway lit by fluorescent lights, and had pressed her forehead against the wall, and had not cried, because crying would have meant beginning to accept it, and she was not yet ready. She had nursed him for 14 months. She had sold her piano to pay for the medications insurance would not cover. She had sold her wedding ring to pay for the hospice. She had sold the small apartment they had bought together to pay for the funeral, and when there was nothing left to sell, she had carried 2 suitcases out of a city she could no longer afford, and had taken a bus west to a town she had chosen because she had liked the way it sounded on the timetable. Bremerton County. She had been 26 years old. She had not played a single note of music since the night before he died. For 6 years she had moved through low-paying work the way a leaf moves through a stream, never settling, never noticed. She had waited tables. She had stocked shelves. She had cleaned offices in a building downtown, where the night janitor played a small radio at the security desk and never spoke to her except to nod good evening. And then 10 months ago, she had answered an advertisement on a coffee shop bulletin board for a position at a private estate. Discretion required, lodging available on premises. She had taken the position because the lodging meant she could finally stop sleeping in her car. She had not told Caspian Holloway any of this. He had not asked. He had glanced at her resume for the length of time it took a man like him to glance at anything that did not directly concern him, and he had hired her on the recommendation of his housekeeper, a tall, stern woman named Mrs. Pendleworth, who had taken one look at Ondine and had recognized something she could not name. For 10 months, Ondine had cleaned the rooms of the estate. She had dusted the bookshelves. She had ironed the linens. She had polished the silver. She had asked for nothing, and she had received nothing in return except a small wage and a small room above the carriage house, where she slept with the photograph of Thaddeus on the bedside table and the white envelope in the drawer beneath it. She had not told a single person at the estate that she had once played Carnegie Hall. She had not told them about the Steinway recording she had made at 23, the one that had been quietly remastered last year by a label she had not contacted in 7 years and released to a kind of attention she had never asked for. She had not told them that the photograph she carried was of her late husband, or that the white envelope contained a letter he had written to her 3 days before he died, a letter she had not yet been brave enough to open. She had told them nothing. And so when Caspian Holloway had laughed with his friend in the breakfast room and had decided that her presence at his gala would make for an evening of marvelous entertainment, he had been laughing at a woman whose name he did not even fully know how to pronounce. Tonight she would walk through the eastern doors. Tonight she would cross the marble foyer. Tonight she would enter the ballroom where 200 strangers were waiting to witness whatever embarrassment Caspian had promised them, and she would do something none of them, including Caspian himself, had any way of expecting. She rested one gloved hand on the frame of the door. She thought of her father at the piano. She thought of Thaddeus on the bridge in the snow. She made a decision that she would not have been able to name if anyone had asked her to. Then she stepped inside. The ballroom had been transformed for the evening into something that resembled the inside of a snow globe. 8 chandeliers hung from a coffered ceiling painted to look like a winter sky. White roses spilled from silver urns at every column. A string quartet played beneath a balcony draped in pale linen, and the air smelled of beeswax and citrus, and the faint sweetness of expensive perfume layered too thickly. 200 guests were already inside. They stood in clusters near the bar. They circled the long banquet tables. They held flutes of champagne the color of pale honey. They laughed in the way wealthy people laugh at parties, which is to say, with their mouths only, while their eyes scanned the room for someone more important to speak to. Ondine crossed the foyer alone. She had practiced walking in heels for 2 evenings in the small room above the carriage house, pacing back and forth across the narrow strip of carpet between her bed and her dresser. She had practiced holding her chin level. She had practiced breathing through her nose. She had practiced the small, neutral expression of a woman who was not afraid, even though she was, even though her hands beneath the white gloves had not stopped trembling since she had stepped out of the carriage house. The first guest to notice her was a woman in emerald velvet standing near the entrance. The woman lifted her champagne flute halfway to her mouth and did not complete the gesture. The man beside her, who had been mid-sentence, fell quiet and turned. A third guest behind them turned because the first 2 had turned. And then, like a wave moving through the room in the slow, patient way that waves move, the heads of 200 people began to lift, and the conversations began to thin, and the string quartet, sensing without understanding what was happening, faltered for half a beat before recovering. She kept walking. She did not know what they were seeing. She did not know that the navy silk caught the chandelier light in a way that made the gown seem to ripple as she moved. She did not know that her unadorned throat, the absence of jewelry, made her appear among the bejeweled women in the room not less than them, but somehow other than them, as if she had walked in from a different century. She did not know that her face, which had spent 10 months looking at the floor, was now lifted and composed and quiet in a way that made every other face in the room suddenly seem loud. She walked toward the center of the ballroom, where Caspian stood beside Renwick Cole and a small group of men in dinner jackets, all of them holding tumblers of cognac, all of them turning now to see what the silence was about. Caspian saw her. For 1/4 of 1 second, his expression did something it had not done in 20 years. It opened. The mask of polished amusement he wore at all times in all rooms slipped a fraction, and underneath it was a face that did not know what it was looking at. Then he recovered. The mask slid back into place. He smiled the smile he had been practicing all week. "Well," he said, loudly enough to carry, "look who decided to grace us with her presence." The men around him laughed. Renwick stepped forward. He was a thin man with a long, pale face and the kind of mouth that always looked as though it had just finished saying something cruel. He raised his glass toward her. "Miss Vasper, did you find the silverware all right? I know it can be confusing for someone new to formal dining." The men laughed again. Ondine stopped walking. She stood 3 paces from them, her gloved hands clasped lightly in front of her. She did not answer. She did not blush. She did not lower her eyes. She did not give them the reaction the joke had been built to produce. She simply looked at Caspian Holloway, and she waited. The silence stretched. It was Caspian who looked away first. It was so small that no one in the room would have called it a defeat. But Caspian, who had not lowered his eyes to another human being in more than 30 years, knew exactly what had just happened. The small muscle at the corner of his jaw, the one that tightened when he was about to say something he had not yet decided to say, began to twitch. "Drink?" he asked. "No, thank you," she said. Her voice was the first thing any of them had heard from her. It was lower than they had expected, quieter. There was no accent, no nervous lift at the end of the sentence, nothing that gave them anywhere to hook a second joke onto. She turned her head slightly and looked past him, past Renwick, past the small group of men, and her eyes settled for the first time on the far end of the ballroom, where a long platform had been set up beneath the balcony. On that platform stood a black, grand piano. She had not known it would be there. She had not been told. The piano had been brought in for the evening's entertainment, a young pianist flown in from Vienna who would perform after dinner, a small detail in a long evening of small details that the staff had not bothered to mention to her because she was the staff. But the piano was there. And Ondine Vasper, who had not touched a piano in 7 years, who had not allowed herself to so much as walk past a music store window in 7 years, looked at the long curve of its lid and felt something inside her chest move. She did not yet know what she would do. She knew only that the white envelope in her clutch was suddenly very warm against her wrist. Across the ballroom, near a window that looked out onto the dark gardens, an old man was watching. He was 81 years old. He stood with both hands resting on the silver head of a walking stick that he did not actually need, but that he had carried for the past 40 years because it had once belonged to his father. His hair was white and very fine. His eyes were a pale, watery blue that had once been sharper, and that had now settled into the gentle, far-seeing quality of eyes that have spent too long looking at too many faces and have learned to recognize something underneath all of them. His name was Aurelio Brandt. Most of the people in the room did not know that name. The older guests, the ones who had been collecting art and attending galas for 40 years, recognized it the way one recognizes the name of a small country one has never visited. He had been a concert producer once, a long time ago. He had run a recording label in Vienna. He had retired in 1998 and had moved to a small house in the foothills outside Bremerton County, and he attended exactly 2 events a year, of which the Holloway Foundation Gala was one because his late wife had loved it. He had been standing at the window for the last 40 minutes, half listening to a conversation about thoroughbred horses that he was not contributing to, and he had watched the woman in navy silk enter the ballroom. He had watched her cross the foyer. He had watched the heads turn. He had watched her stop in front of the host and not flinch. And now he was watching her look at the piano on the far platform. And something in the way she looked at it, something in the particular stillness that came over her face, made Aurelio slowly straighten his back against the silver head of his walking stick. He had seen that stillness before. He had seen it in a green room in Vienna 14 years ago, when a young American pianist had stood backstage before a performance and had looked at the closed lid of a Bösendorfer with exactly that expression, the expression of someone greeting a thing they loved more than they had words for. He had seen it in a recording studio in London 12 years ago when the same young woman had sat down at a Steinway and had played the second movement of a Schubert sonata so quietly and so precisely that the engineer had wept openly into the soundboard. He had been trying to find that woman for 10 months. His agent had been trying. His old contacts had been trying. The label had been trying. She had walked away from her career after a personal tragedy, and the music world had assumed she had wanted to disappear. And so the music world, in the way that the music world always does when given a reason to stop looking, had stopped looking. But the re-release of her recording last winter had changed everything. Something about it, something about the particular hush of the second movement, had caught a generation of listeners who had never heard her name. The album had begun to sell. There were 3 concert halls in 3 different countries that wanted to commission her for a return performance. There was a documentary in development. There was a recording contract waiting. And no one could find her. He stared across the ballroom at her. He could not see her face fully from this distance, but he had stood at the back of enough concert halls in his lifetime to know what it looked like when a pianist saw a piano they were not expecting to see. His old hand tightened on the silver head of the walking stick. He turned slowly, scanning the room until he found a young man in catering uniform passing with a tray of empty glasses. He raised one finger. The young man stopped. "Sir?" "The woman in navy, standing near the host. Do you know her name?" The young man glanced across the room. His face flickered with a small, embarrassed expression. "That's the maid, sir." "The maid?" "Yes, sir, from the estate. Mr. Holloway invited her as a, well." The young man hesitated. "As a sort of joke, sir." Aurelio was quiet for a long moment. "What is her name?" he asked again, and his voice had changed slightly. It was lower now. "Vasper, I think, sir. Ondine Vasper." He closed his eyes. For a long moment, he did not move. When he opened them, the reflection in the window showed an old man whose face had gone very still, in the way that faces go still when something long grieved has unexpectedly come home. He thought of his daughter. He thought of Liesel, who had been 24 years old when the car had gone off the road on a wet October night many years ago. He thought of how she had played the piano. He thought of how, after she had died, he had spent 40 years producing other people's daughters because his own had not lived long enough to record a single album. He thought of the recording he had made with Ondine when she was 23, the recording he had stayed in the studio for, long past midnight, because he had heard in her playing the same particular hush he had once heard in Liesel's. He had never told her that. He had never told anyone. He pulled a small leather notebook from the inside pocket of his dinner jacket. He took out a fountain pen. He wrote a single name, then a single sentence, and he tore the page out and folded it twice. He turned to the young man. "I need you to find someone for me. His name is Henrik Vance. He is sitting at the second table on the left, with the silver-haired woman in burgundy. Do you see him?" "Yes, sir." "Give him this note. Do not open it. Do not read it. Do not let anyone else see it. Place it directly into his hand." The young man took the folded note. Aurelio watched him cross the ballroom, and he prepared, in the careful, quiet way that old men prepare for important things, to wait. The cruelty of Caspian Holloway was not the kind that announced itself. He did not raise his voice. He did not throw glasses. The cruelty of Caspian Holloway lived in the small adjustments of his face, in the angle of his smile, in the particular timing of when he chose to laugh and when he chose to fall silent. He had learned by the time he was 12 years old that humiliation lasted longer when it was administered with elegance, and he had spent the 30 years since refining the technique. He stepped closer to Ondine. He did not crowd her. He simply moved into her field of vision in a way that made her have to choose between looking at him or looking past him, and he smiled the smile he wore when he was about to be interesting. "Miss Vasper, I'm so glad you came. It would have been disappointing if you had been too proud to accept." He let the word proud rest in the air for a beat too long. The men laughed. Renwick tilted his head with theatrical curiosity. "Tell us, Miss Vasper, have you ever been to a gala before? I imagine the protocol must seem rather overwhelming." She looked at Renwick. Her face did not change. "No," she said quietly. "I have not been to a gala." "Ah, I have only performed at them." The word performed sat in the air for 1 full second before any of the men registered what she had said. Renwick blinked. Caspian's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did. The men around them, the ones who had been laughing on cue, stopped laughing, not because they understood, but because they had felt the air change and did not know why. "I'm sorry," Caspian said, his voice still light. "Performed?" She did not answer. She had turned away from him in the middle of his sentence, a thing no one had ever done to Caspian Holloway in living memory, and she was walking again, slowly, deliberately, across the polished floor toward the platform at the far end. The string quartet, who had been playing a comfortable Mendelssohn quartet they had played 1,000 times before, watched her come and did not understand what they were watching. The conversations near the platform thinned. The conversations behind her thinned. The room, which had been arranging itself back into the comfortable hum of a gala, began once again to fall quiet. And this time the quiet was not a wave, but a held breath. Caspian was no longer smiling. He took 2 steps after her before he caught himself and stopped, because he had realized with the particular delayed clarity of a man who had drunk just enough cognac to be confident and not enough to be careful, that he could not now follow her without confirming to 200 witnesses that he had lost control of his own room. He stood very still. He turned his head slightly toward Renwick. "What is she doing?" Renwick did not answer. Renwick's mouth was open in the small, soft way that mouths open when their owners have not yet chosen what to say. Across the room, the young man in catering uniform had reached the second table on the left. He had bent slightly at the waist. He had pressed the folded note into the hand of a man with iron-gray hair and a beard trimmed close to the jaw. A man who had been in the middle of telling a story and who now looked at the note with mild irritation. Then, with a flicker of recognition, then, with something that made him stop talking entirely and rise from his chair. Henrik Vance was 63 years old. He was the senior conductor of the Bremerton Symphony, and he had known Aurelio Brandt for 31 years. He read the note. He read it a second time. Then he folded it back and placed it carefully in his inside pocket, and he turned toward the window where Aurelio stood. And the 2 old men exchanged a look across the length of the ballroom, the kind of look that does not need to be translated because it has already been understood. Henrik began to walk toward the platform. Ondine was halfway across the room. She had not yet reached the steps. She did not know that the old man at the window had recognized her name. She did not know that the conductor of the symphony was now walking on a parallel line that would intersect with hers in exactly 40 seconds. She knew only that the piano was in front of her. She knew that she had not touched a piano in 7 years. She knew that the last time her hands had rested on keys had been in a hospital room in February, while a man she had loved more than music itself had slept against a pillow that was too thin, and she had played for him a song he had written for her in a notebook she still kept in the bottom drawer of her bedside table. She had told herself she would never play again. She had told herself many things in the last 7 years, most of them necessary, most of them the small, careful lies that grief teaches the grieving to tell themselves so that they can keep getting out of bed. But Caspian Holloway had invited her to this gala as a joke, and the piano was here. Ondine Vasper, who had walked into this room as a maid and had been mocked as a maid, took the first step onto the platform. The string quartet stopped playing. Henrik Vance, 15 feet from the platform, also stopped. The room, which had been pretending to resume its conversations, gave up the pretense entirely. 200 faces turned toward her as she stood beside the black grand piano with one gloved hand resting lightly on its lid, the way a person rests a hand on the shoulder of someone they have not seen in a very long time. She pulled the gloves slowly from her hands. She set them on top of the piano. She sat down on the bench, and the room, which had been built to be the most important room in Bremerton County for one night of the year, became something else entirely. It became a hall. It became a chamber. It became the kind of held silence that exists in only two places in the world: in churches, the moment before the choir begins, and in concert halls, the moment before the first note. She lifted her hands. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a long moment, and somewhere in the back of the room, a woman in emerald velvet pressed her palm flat against her own chest without knowing she was doing it. Ondine closed her eyes. She thought of her father at the piano in the house at the end of Wexford Lane. She thought of her husband on the bridge in the snow. She thought of the white envelope. She lowered her hands to the keys. The first note was so quiet that the people standing nearest the platform leaned forward without realizing they were leaning. It was a single low B-flat, struck softly, allowed to bloom and decay in the warm air before the second note followed. Then a third. Then a phrase. Then the slow, unfolding opening of a piece that perhaps a third of the people in the room recognized, and that the other two-thirds did not need to recognize, to understand. It was the adagio from a sonata her father had taught her when she was 9 years old. She had not played it since the morning of his funeral. She played as if she had never stopped playing. The 7 years of silence between her and the keys did not exist for her now. Her hands knew. Her hands had remembered for her. The way hands remember things that the rest of the body has forced itself to forget. And the music came out of her fingers slowly at first, the way water returns to a riverbed after a drought. Then with more confidence. Then with the particular tender certainty of a musician who had come home to an instrument that had been waiting for her. In the back of the ballroom, the old man with white hair was no longer standing. He had moved to a small velvet bench near the window, and he had sat down on it heavily, both hands resting on the silver head of the walking stick, and he was weeping silently in the way that old men weep at certain moments, with no movement of the face and no sound, only the slow, steady running of tears down the lines that decades had carved around his eyes. He was crying because he had not been wrong. He had stood at the back of enough concert halls in his lifetime to know what it sounded like when a great pianist returned to the piano after being away. He had not been wrong for 10 months, and now the rightness was sitting on a bench in Bremerton County in a borrowed gown. In the center of the room, the cluster of men around Caspian Holloway had gone still, in the way that men go still when something they had assumed was simple turns out to be something else entirely. Renwick Cole had taken a small step backward, almost without realizing it. Caspian had not moved at all. The polished smile was gone. The angle of his jaw was slack. He was looking at her with an expression of a man who had just realized, in real time, in front of 200 witnesses, that he had made a mistake that could not be unmade. The string quartet had set their instruments on their stands. The cellist had pressed both hands flat against her mouth. The waiters had stopped circulating. The bartenders had stopped pouring. A woman in emerald velvet was crying without apology. So was the man beside her. So were 3 women near the bar. So was an older gentleman seated at table 7 who had not cried in public since his wife had died 11 years ago. Ondine reached the second movement. She did not look up. She did not glance at the audience. She did not perform for them. She was not playing for them. She was playing for a man who had taught her this piece in a kitchen, with the back door open onto a field of alfalfa, and she was playing for another man who had asked her to marry him on a bridge in the snow. And she was playing for the 7 years she had lived, pretending she was no longer the woman who could do this thing. She played the second movement to its end. She held the final chord until it faded into the room and could no longer be heard. Then she let her hands rest in her lap. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room that did not know what to do. It was the silence of a room that knew exactly what it had just heard, and could not yet bring itself to break the moment by acknowledging it. It lasted 3 seconds. It lasted 4. It lasted a full 5 seconds before a single pair of hands at the back of the ballroom began to clap, slowly, deliberately, the way an old man claps when he is trying to keep his hands from shaking. Aurelio was on his feet. The walking stick had fallen to the floor beside the velvet bench. He was applauding with both hands raised, his pale blue eyes fixed on the woman at the piano. A second pair of hands joined him, then a third, then a 10th, then the room. 200 people rose to their feet. They applauded for 30 seconds, then 40, then a full minute. The sound was not the polite applause of a charity gala. It was the long, roaring applause of a concert hall, the kind that happens when an audience has understood that what they have just witnessed will be a story they tell for the rest of their lives. She did not stand. She sat at the piano with her hands folded in her lap, and she lowered her head, and a single tear traveled the long, quiet line of her cheek. When she finally lifted her face, she did not look at Caspian Holloway. She looked across the room, past the applauding strangers, and her eyes found the old man at the back of the room, who was still applauding with both hands raised and tears running freely down his face. She did not know who he was, but something in the way he was looking at her, something in the recognition that had no need to identify itself, made her dip her head once toward him. The smallest possible bow, the acknowledgement one musician makes to another across the length of a great room. He bowed back, more deeply than his 81-year-old back wanted him to bow. Henrik Vance, who had stopped 15 feet from the platform, was now walking the rest of the distance. He climbed the 3 steps. He approached the piano slowly, the way one approaches an animal one does not wish to startle. He spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Miss Vasper, my name is Henrik Vance. I am the conductor of the Bremerton Symphony. There is a man at the back of this room who has been trying to find you for 10 months. He would very much like to speak with you. When you are ready. Not before." He bowed his head, and he turned, and he walked back down the steps of the platform, and he stood at the foot of the stage in a small protective posture that no one had asked him to take. The applause was still going. Ondine looked down at her hands. Then she looked at the small clutch sitting on the music stand of the piano. She reached for it. The white envelope inside had been warm against her wrist all evening, and she had not opened it. And something about playing the adagio her father had taught her, something about the way the room had risen to its feet, had loosened a small tight thing in her chest that she had not known was still tight. She rested her hand on the clutch. She did not yet open it, but she had begun to think about opening it. A side door at the rear of the ballroom opened, and a tall woman in a charcoal suit stepped through it with the small, unobtrusive movement of staff who knew exactly when to appear. Her name was Mrs. Pendleworth. She was the housekeeper of the estate, the same stern, tall woman who had hired Ondine 10 months ago without asking the questions the resume had not answered. The housekeeper did not glance at Caspian Holloway. She did not glance at Renwick Cole. She crossed the ballroom in 12 unhurried strides, climbed the 3 steps of the platform, and stopped beside the piano bench. She bent slightly, her hand resting on the bench beside Ondine's elbow, and she spoke in a voice pitched precisely for Ondine alone. "There is a small library off the east corridor, child. The fire is already lit. I have asked the staff to bring tea. Would you like me to walk with you?" Ondine looked up. The face that had been stern and remote for 10 months was not stern now. It was the face of a woman who had been waiting to be allowed to do exactly this. "Yes," she said quietly. "Please." Mrs. Pendleworth offered her arm. Ondine rose. The applause, which had been slowly settling into the long, stunned murmur of a room trying to understand what it had just witnessed, surged again as she stepped down from the platform. She walked past the string quartet, past Henrik Vance, who inclined his head as she passed, and out of the ballroom through a small servant's door that closed behind them with the particular quiet authority of a door that had been opened and closed in this house 1,000 times before Caspian had inherited it. The library was warm. A fire had been lit. A teapot and 2 cups sat on a low table between 2 leather chairs. The room smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and the door, when it closed behind them, made the soft, definitive sound of a door that had been built to keep the world out. Ondine sat down in one of the leather chairs. The housekeeper poured the tea. She handed one cup to Ondine. She did not sit. She stood beside the fireplace with her hands folded in front of her, and she waited. Ondine cupped the tea in both hands. She did not drink it. She looked into it. "You knew," she said quietly after a long moment. The other woman did not pretend not to understand. "I suspected. I did not know." "How?" "Your hands, child. The first morning you came to be interviewed. The way they moved when they were not being watched. The small, unconscious shapes they made between tasks. I have been the housekeeper of 3 musical households in my lifetime. I know what a pianist's hands look like when they are not being permitted to play." Ondine closed her eyes. "I did not say anything," the housekeeper continued, more quietly. "I do not say things that are not mine to say. But when I heard what Mr. Holloway had planned for this evening, I made certain decisions. I asked the laundry to clean the navy gown. I asked Verona, the girl who comes in on Saturdays, to set your hair. I did not tell anyone why." "Why?" Ondine asked. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked into the fire. "I had a sister once. She was a soprano. She married a man who did not allow her to sing, not loudly, not violently, in the quieter way of a man who slowly arranges a woman's life so that there is no longer any room in it for the thing she loves." She paused. "By the time my sister left him, she could no longer remember how to begin. She did not sing again." She turned from the fire. "I am 71 years old. I have wondered for 30 years what it would have taken. One person. One door opening at the right moment. When I heard what Mr. Holloway intended this evening, I decided that if there was even the smallest chance that you were what I suspected you were, the door would open." Ondine could not speak. She set the tea down because her hands had begun to tremble. There was a soft knock at the library door. Mrs. Pendleworth crossed the room and opened it 6 inches. Henrik Vance stood in the corridor. Behind him stood the old man with white hair and pale blue eyes, leaning on the silver head of his walking stick, his face still wet. She glanced back at Ondine. Ondine nodded once. The 2 old men entered. Henrik closed the door behind them. Aurelio Brandt walked, slowly, with the careful steadiness of a man who had once produced one of the most acclaimed recordings of the 20th century, and who was now standing in a small library in front of a woman he had been searching for. He stopped in front of her chair. He did not extend his hand. He bowed. It was the slow, formal bow of an old European gentleman. When he straightened, he looked at her with an expression that contained no presumption, no demand, no expectation that she owed him anything for finding her. "Miss Vasper, my name is Aurelio Brandt. Your husband once wrote a small piece for piano and clarinet that I produced in 2009, before you had married him. He was a kind young man. I am very sorry." Her hand rose to her mouth. "I produced your Schubert recording," he continued. "I sat in the booth for 14 hours. I told the engineer to keep the tape rolling even when we had everything we needed, because I did not want to miss anything that might happen if you played past the planned ending. You played for 3 more hours. We have those tapes still. We have never released them." She was crying now, quietly, without sound. "The remastered album was not my decision. I had retired by then. A younger colleague pressed for the re-release without consulting me. I would have asked for your permission first, and I am sorry that we did not. The label would like, very much, to make this right with you. But that is a conversation for another day. That is not what I have come to say tonight." He was quiet for a moment. "I came to this county 2 months ago because of a thin rumor. I did not believe it. I came anyway. I am 81 years old, and I have learned that the things one regrets in life are the trips one did not take on the strength of a thin rumor." He paused. I did not know that I would hear you play tonight. I have heard 1,000 pianists in my lifetime, Miss Vasper. I will not insult you by telling you what I just heard. I will only say that whatever you wish to do with the rest of your life, the world is ready when you are ready, and not 1 second before. He reached into the inside pocket of his dinner jacket. He took out a small white card, plain, without embossing, with only a name and a phone number printed on it. He set it on the low table beside her untouched tea. You do not need to call this number tomorrow. You do not need to call it next month. You may never call it. That is your right. He paused. But it is here, if and when you wish to use it. She looked at the card. He did not wait for an answer. He bowed once more, and he turned to leave. Henrik opened the library door for him. The two old men stepped into the corridor. Mrs. Pendleworth, after one last look at Ondine, followed them out and closed the door behind her. Ondine was alone. She looked at the card on the table. She looked at the clutch she had set on the arm of her chair. She did not yet open it, but she had moved closer, in the last hour, to opening it than she had been in many years, and that was enough for now. She did not return to the ballroom. Mrs. Pendleworth, returning to the library 20 minutes later, found her standing at the window with the card in one hand and the clutch in the other, looking out at the dark gardens. I have asked Otis to bring the small car around. He will drive you back to the carriage house. You do not have to come back to the main house tomorrow. You do not have to come back to the main house ever, if that is what you choose. I will speak with Mr. Holloway. Ondine turned from the window. Thank you, she said. The two women looked at each other for a long moment. Then the older one, who had not embraced another woman in 12 years, opened her arms slightly, the smallest possible offer, and Ondine stepped into them, and the two of them stood there in the warm, small library while the gala continued in the ballroom on the other side of the house. Otis was waiting at the side entrance with the small black car. He did not say anything when she approached. He held the door open. He drove her along the curving driveway in silence. He stopped at the carriage house. He waited until she had let herself inside. Then he tipped his cap and drove back to the main house at exactly the same speed at which he had driven away. The room above the carriage house was the same room she had left 3 hours ago. The narrow bed, the small dresser, the strip of carpet she had paced in heels for 2 evenings, the photograph of Thaddeus on the bedside table, the drawer beneath it where the white envelope had lived. Ondine sat on the edge of the bed. She set the clutch beside her. She set the card on top of it. She placed her hands flat on her knees, the way she had been taught to place them as a child when she was about to play a difficult piece, and she breathed. She thought about the ballroom. She thought about the applause. She thought about the old man who had wept while she played. She thought about the housekeeper who had pressed a navy gown for her without telling her why. She thought about the conductor who had bowed his head when she passed. She thought about Caspian. She found, when she looked for the anger she had expected to find, that it was not there. There was only a small, clean distance, the kind that opens in a person when they have stopped carrying something they had not known they were carrying. She opened the clutch. She took out the photograph of Thaddeus first. She looked at it. She set it gently on the bedside table beside the framed one, the smaller worn one beside the larger formal one, the way a person sets 2 halves of the same memory beside each other. She took out the handkerchief. Then she took out the envelope. It was thin. The paper had yellowed at the edges. Her name was written across the front in a handwriting she had not allowed herself to look at. The slightly slanted script of a young composer with ink-stained fingers who had written her a letter 3 days before he died, and had given it to her with the instruction that she should open it only when she was ready to begin again. She had not been ready. She had told herself many things about why she was not ready. Some of them had been true. All of them had been necessary. She held the envelope in both hands. She thought about her father at the piano. She thought about her husband on the bridge in the snow. She thought about the adagio she had played, the one she had not played since the morning of her father's funeral, and how her hands had remembered it for her even when the rest of her had not believed she could. She slid one finger under the flap. The seal gave easily. It had been waiting. The letter inside was a single sheet of folded paper. She unfolded it slowly. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she pressed it to her face, and she wept. Not the quiet, contained tears she had been carrying, but the full kind, the kind that come up from the place a person has been protecting for so long that they had stopped believing the place still existed. She did not need to share what the letter said. She would never share what the letter said. It belonged to her, and to the man who had written it, and to no one else. But when she lowered it, when she folded it carefully back into thirds and placed it on the bedside table beside the two photographs, she was a woman who had finally been given permission, by the only person whose permission had ever mattered to her, on the subject of beginning again, to begin again. She picked up the card. She looked at the phone number printed on it. She did not call it that night. She did not call it the next morning. She placed the card in the top drawer of the dresser, beside the folded letter, and she went to bed in her stockinged feet, because she was too tired to undress, and she slept for 14 hours, the deepest sleep she had slept in 7 years. She called the number on the third day. The story of what had happened at the gala began to travel before the sun came up. It traveled the way stories travel in counties like Bremerton, which is to say slowly at first, and then all at once. It traveled through the catering staff who had stood frozen with their trays. It traveled through the string quartet who had set down their instruments. It traveled through the woman in emerald velvet, and through the older gentleman at table 7, and through the young man in catering uniform who had carried a folded note across a ballroom and would tell that detail at every dinner party he attended for the rest of his life. By Sunday evening, a recording of the second movement had appeared online. Someone in the room had quietly held up a phone. The video was 46 seconds long. It had no caption, no name attached to the woman at the piano. It was simply 46 seconds of a woman in navy silk playing an adagio in a room that had fallen silent around her. By Monday morning, the video had been viewed 200,000 times. By Tuesday, the classical music corner of the internet had identified the woman as the pianist who had recorded a Schubert sonata 12 years earlier and had then disappeared. By Wednesday, 3 different European recording labels had begun sending inquiries to Aurelio Brandt's old office in Vienna. A journalist from a national magazine began making phone calls to the estate. The journalist did not get past Mrs. Pendleworth. The housekeeper, in her 31st hour as the de facto guardian of Ondine Vasper's privacy, had developed a small, efficient method for handling such calls. She thanked the journalist for their interest. She informed them that the estate did not provide statements about its staff. She wished them a pleasant afternoon. She hung up. She kept a list of every name, and on the third day, she handed that list to a woman named Marisol Quaid, the family attorney Aurelio had quietly placed in motion the morning after the gala. Marisol Quaid was 48 years old. She had built her practice on representing artists, performers, and estates of the deceased. She did not lose. She had been called the morning after the gala because Aurelio had told his associate in Vienna that he did not want a single industry decision to be made on Ondine's behalf without a lawyer in the room who answered to Ondine and to no one else. Marisol drove up from the city on Tuesday afternoon. She met with Ondine in the same library where Aurelio had bowed to her. She brought a leather portfolio and a fountain pen and the patient, watchful expression of a woman who had spent 20 years sitting across from people who had been used by other people and who needed to be reminded that they had the right to say no. Miss Vasper, I have not come here to tell you what to do. I have come here to tell you what your options are. There is a difference, and the difference matters. She laid out the situation in clean, unhurried sentences. The remastered album had generated revenue Ondine had a legal right to. The label had been holding the funds in escrow for 10 months while attempting to locate her. There were 3 concert hall offers, 2 recording contract offers, and 1 documentary inquiry. None of them required an immediate answer. None of them required any answer at all. You can take all of it. You can take none of it. You can take pieces of it. You can disappear again, if that is what you want. I will arrange your disappearance with the same care I would arrange your return. The decision is entirely yours, and I will defend whatever you choose. Ondine listened with her hands folded in her lap. What about Mr. Holloway? She asked. What about him? He has not contacted me. I assumed he would. He will not, Marisol said quietly. I spoke with his attorney yesterday afternoon. Mr. Holloway has been advised by people whose advice he has historically taken that any contact with you at this point would be inadvisable. You will not be hearing from him. Ondine was quiet. Will I be required to leave the carriage house? You will not be required to do anything. The carriage house is yours to occupy for as long as you wish. Rent-free, with no further employment obligations. I would advise you not to accept that arrangement. There are better ones available. But the point is that no one is going to remove you from anywhere. Ondine nodded slowly. I would like to leave. I think. I am not sure where I would go, but I would like to leave. Then we will find you somewhere to go. Take a week. Take 2. There is no hurry. The story of what had happened to Caspian Holloway began to travel as well, though more quietly, in the small protected world of Bremerton County society, which was a world of approximately 60 people who attended each other's parties and donated to each other's foundations. The events of Saturday evening were discussed in the careful, indirect language that such circles use to acknowledge that one of their own had done something unforgivable. 3 families withdrew from the Holloway Foundation Board on Tuesday. A bank that had been preparing to extend a significant line of credit to one of his holding companies quietly tabled the discussion on Wednesday. A senator who had been planning to attend a private dinner at the estate the following weekend sent a polite handwritten note expressing regret that a scheduling conflict had unexpectedly arisen. By the end of the week, Caspian Holloway had not been formally exiled from anything. He had simply found that the rooms he had moved through for 30 years were no longer arranging themselves around him in the small, unconscious ways he had come to depend upon. The shift was so quiet that no one in those rooms would ever have called it a punishment. It was merely the slow, steady withdrawal of a privilege he had assumed all his life was inherent rather than granted. Renwick Cole stopped returning his calls on the 4th day. That was the moment, Caspian would later realize, at which something inside him understood that the world had decided. He did not call her. He did not write to her. He had been advised not to, and for once in his life, he took advice. He sat in the library of his estate, in the same wing chair he had sat in for 30 years, and he looked at the polished bookshelves that Ondine Vasper had dusted for 10 months, and he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he could not remember a single one of the conversations he had ever had in this room. He could remember only that there had been a woman dusting the bookcases, and that he had not, in 10 months, ever once looked at her face long enough to know what color her eyes were. He poured himself a drink. He did not drink it. He sat in the chair until the room grew dark, and he did not turn on the lamp. 6 months later, on a clear May afternoon, Ondine Vasper carried a single suitcase up the front steps of a small brick row house on a tree-lined street in a city 300 miles east of Bremerton County. She had bought the house in March. She had bought it with money that had been hers for 10 months, and that she had not known was hers. She had bought it without consulting anyone after walking through it on a Tuesday afternoon with a quiet realtor who had not recognized her name and had treated her with the friendly, attentive courtesy that quiet realtors reserve for women who arrive alone and seem to know what they are looking for. The house had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen with a window that looked out onto a back garden, a narrow staircase that creaked on the 4th step, and a front room with high ceilings and tall south-facing windows that filled the entire room with light from late morning until early afternoon. In that front room, against the wall opposite the windows, stood a Steinway grand piano. She had bought the piano 2 weeks after the house. She had not bought a new one. She had bought a refurbished instrument from 1968 that had once belonged to a teacher at a small conservatory in Boston. She had played it for 20 minutes in the showroom. She had told the dealer she would take it. She had asked them to deliver it on a Tuesday because Tuesdays had always been her father's lesson day at the high school, and she had wanted the piano to come into her home on a day that would have meant something to him. The piano had arrived 3 weeks later. She had not played it for the first 4 days. She had simply lived in the house with it. She had made tea in the small kitchen and carried it into the front room and sat in a chair across from the piano and read books and watched the light move across the lid. On the 5th day, she had opened the lid and rested her hands on the keys, and she had played a single note, and then a phrase, and then she had played for 2 hours without stopping. And when she had finally stood up from the bench, her hands had been shaking, but the shaking had been the shaking of return rather than the shaking of fear, and that was a difference she had learned to recognize. She had begun teaching in April. It had been Marisol Quade's suggestion, made gently. There were 3 young students in the city who had been studying with an older teacher who had recently retired, 3 serious students who needed a teacher of a certain caliber and whose families could not afford the conservatory. Marisol had asked quietly whether Ondine would consider taking them on. 2 afternoons a week. A small income that Ondine did not need. A small purpose that Ondine had not realized she had been missing. She had said yes. She had not yet accepted any of the concert offers. She had not yet signed any recording contracts. She had not yet agreed to the documentary, which Marisol had successfully stalled on her behalf. Aurelio Brandt had called her once, in late January, simply to ask how she was. He had not pressed her about her career. He had told her that he was 81 years old and that he was very glad she was alive in the world, and he had wished her a quiet spring, and he had hung up. She had cried for an hour after that phone call. But by May, she had begun to understand that she did not have to choose between the woman she had been at 23 and the woman she had become. She could be both. She could play the piano in the front room of a house that belonged to her, and she could teach 3 serious children on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and she could decide, slowly, in her own time, which of the larger doors she would walk through and which she would leave closed. The house was hers. The piano was hers. The decisions were hers. She set the suitcase down in the front hall. She walked into the front room. She crossed to the piano. She rested her hand on its lid in the same way she had rested her hand on the lid of the Black Grand at the Holloway estate 6 months earlier. The way a person rests a hand on the shoulder of someone they love and have not seen in a very long time. The afternoon light came through the south-facing windows and lay across the keys in long, warm bands. Ondine sat down on the bench. She did not play yet. She simply sat, and she breathed. And she looked at her hands resting in her lap. On the small table beside the piano she had placed 3 things. The photograph of Thaddeus, a photograph of her father at the piano in the house at the end of Wexford Lane, and the folded letter, the one she had finally opened on the night of the gala, now kept in a small wooden box she had lined with a piece of the navy silk gown she had worn that night. She did not need to read the letter again. She had memorized its few quiet sentences. She had begun to live them. She lifted her hands. She played. 11 months after the night at the Holloway estate, on a cold October afternoon in the city 300 miles east, an old man with white hair and pale blue eyes stepped out of a black car at the corner of a tree-lined street and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, leaning lightly on the silver head of a walking stick. Aurelio Brandt was 82 now. He was a little slower than he had been a year ago. The walking stick was no longer purely sentimental, but his pale blue eyes were the same, and the soft Austrian accent was the same when he turned to the young assistant who had driven him here and asked her, very quietly, to wait in the car. He had not told Ondine he was coming. He had been in the city for 2 days, on the small, careful business of an old man tying up the loose ends of a long career. He had finished the last of his meetings that morning. He had asked his assistant to drive him to the address Marisol Quaid had quietly provided 3 weeks earlier, with the gentle instruction that he was welcome to walk past, but that he should not, under any circumstances, ring the bell. He had no intention of ringing the bell. He walked slowly along the tree-lined street. The October light was the color of pale honey. The leaves on the maples had turned the deep red that maples turn in this part of the country in mid-October, and a few of them had begun to drift down to the sidewalk, and one of them caught on the silver head of his walking stick as he walked, and he smiled without realizing he was smiling. He stopped across the street from a small brick row house with tall south-facing windows on the front. The windows were open. He stood very still on the sidewalk. Inside the front room, a woman was teaching a young student to play a piece by Schumann. He could not see them clearly through the windows, but he could hear the faint cadence of a piano carrying out into the autumn air, the way a teacher's hands and a student's hands work through a phrase together, stopping, starting again, finding it, losing it, finding it again. The cadence was the cadence of a teacher who had once been taught by her own father in a kitchen with the back door open, the cadence of patience and love, and that particular quiet attention that great teachers pass down through generations like a small lit candle handed from one cupped hand to another. He closed his eyes. He thought of Liesel. He thought of how she had been 24 years old when the car had gone off the road on a wet October night, and how he had spent 40 years producing other people's daughters because his own had not lived long enough to record a single album. He had told himself, for 40 years, that the work had been enough. Most of the time, he had believed it. Some of the time, he had not. But standing now on a sidewalk in October, listening to a woman in a front room teach a piece by Schumann, listening to the slow, patient cadence of a voice that had been silent for 7 years and was now carrying music again, the way water carries light. He understood, for the first time in 40 years, what the work had actually been for. It had not been for Liesel. Liesel was gone, and no recording could bring her back, and he had made his peace with that grief many decades ago in a quieter way than this. The work had been for the small possibility, never guaranteed, never even particularly likely, that one day there would be a woman somewhere in a borrowed gown who needed a stranger to recognize her across a room and hand a folded note to a conductor, and that he would be the stranger in that room. He had been the stranger in that room. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, and then he turned, slowly, the way an old man turns when he has come to do a thing and has done it, and he walked back toward the black car at the corner. He did not look back. His assistant opened the car door for him. He settled into the back seat. He rested both hands on the silver head of the walking stick. The car pulled away from the corner and joined the slow weekday traffic of an October afternoon, carrying him toward the airport, toward Vienna, toward the quiet last chapter of a long career that had finally, after 40 years, written its closing line. He would not return to that street. He would not need to. Inside the small brick house, the lesson continued. Ondine Vasper was bent slightly over the keyboard beside her student, her finger hovering above a single key, her voice patient. The student tried the phrase again. This time, she found it. Undine smiled, the slow, quiet smile of a woman who had once been told, by the only person whose permission had ever mattered to her on the subject of beginning again, that she had permission to begin again. The piece moved forward. The afternoon light moved across the keys. In a small wooden box on the table beside the piano, lined with a strip of navy silk, a letter rested with all of its sentences memorized and all of its instructions, finally fulfilled. And somewhere in a different city, in a private library at the end of an east corridor, Mrs. Pendleworth was opening a small drawer in the housekeeper's desk and taking out a yellowed photograph of her sister at 22, in a recital dress, holding a single rose. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she pressed it to her lips, the way she had not allowed herself to do in 30 years, and she set it back in the drawer, and she closed the drawer gently, and she went on with the small, steady business of running a household. But she was, in some small, final way, lighter. Some doors, once they have been opened at the right moment, do not close again. Some women, once they have been seen across a room by the person who had been waiting to see them, do not return to invisibility. And some old men, once they have driven away from a sidewalk in October without looking back, finally feel the long weight of a 40-year promise lift, not because the world has changed, but because in one small corner of it, on one cold November evening in Bremerton County, in a borrowed navy gown, in front of a black grand piano, a woman who had been invited as a joke had reminded a room of 200 strangers, and one old man at the back of it. What music sounds like when music returns home. The phrase resolved, the light held, and the music kept going.